Very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I wanted to start by thanking the South Centre, first of all, for inviting me to make a contribution to the book. And it's really an honor to be part of this, publication, to have my chapter as part of the publication. I agree with the points that have been made. I think this is an excellent contribution to an ongoing debate on a topic which is increasingly important in the international community, international investment treaties. I think a lot of what I'm going to say and what is said in the book has been reflected in many parts of the other chapters and in the international debate in general. And a lot of what I've put in reflecting the South African experience draws on the international debate that we've also been part of. So it's an attempt to provide a South African perspective, a perspective from the southern tip of the African continent, but I think it's also one that is increasingly reflected and resonating with the debate in Africa, particularly around the need for structural transformation in Africa. Now, in the way that I structured the chapter, there's probably about 4 or 5 key observations that are made. And again, it's probably not different to what has been touched on by Martin and Carlos already. The first part sets out a kind of a policy perspective on FDI. It's very clear that countries around the world, many countries in Africa, are actively trying to attract FDI. That you will hear in statements by government leaders, by business leaders, an active attempt to attract FDI. But I think, as has been said, as Martin referred to, there is a recognition that the purported benefits of FDI are not automatic. That in order to get the benefits, to secure the benefits of FDI, questions of technology transfer, skills upgrading, linkages to the domestic economy, do not flow automatically from having FDI in the country, but they require a series of a framework, a legislative framework, a regulatory framework that actively seeks to ensure that these purported benefits actually to each of the countries. So it starts off from that policy perspective. The second set of points that are made is that the investment treaties, particularly the early generation investment treaties, and certainly the treaties that South Africa signed in the 1990s, are not geared in that way. They are geared in the way that has already been articulated, that they tend to impose obligations on governments and provide investors with the rights. So they tend to favor investor interest over government's sovereign right to regulate. And this is reflected and it's made manifest in the series of provisions, typical provisions that you find in the treaties. So Martin was again outlining the normal, usual provisions that you find in the treaty, and any analysis of those provisions will show that there tends to be a bias in favor of investors over government's right to regulate. Related to that and compounding the problem are the shortcomings that we've seen in international investment arbitration. It's a system that is one-way traffic. Investors can challenge governments, but these treaties do not allow for governments to challenge wayward behavior by investors. There are questions of conflict of interest that have been raised. There are questions of consistency in the awards of panel arbitration decisions, and there are questions about the correctness in the rationale and thinking of arbitrators in the awards. In sum, the sense is, and I make reference to this in the paper, is that there seems to be a crisis of legitimacy in the international arbitration system, and that has been part of the discussion of the need need to reform the system. The third part of the chapter looks at the empirical evidence on the link between FDI and bilateral investment treaties or international investment agreements. And this is the question the moderator has posed: what was South Africa's experience? South Africa's experience is very much the international experience, that there doesn't seem to be a direct link between signing treaties and securing greater FDI. South Africa receives investment from a number of countries such as the US or Japan, enormous investment over many decades without having an investment treaty in place between the two countries. And we have investment treaties between South Africa and other countries where we get very little FDI flows. So the question of the link between investment treaties and FDI is quite ambiguous, and the summary, the sort of essential point that is made is that the investment treaties are neither necessary nor sufficient to attract FDI. So that's quite an important point, because this has been the fundamental rationale that proponents for investment treaties have used in proposing that countries sign on to investment treaties, that you'll get FDI. The evidence suggests that it's a lot more complex than that. The fourth area, again, I've drawn a lot on the work of UNCTAD on this, but UNCTAD has outlined a reform process, or not necessarily a reform process in this respect, but outlined what countries are doing. I think in general there's great unease around the world about the way the investment regime has operated. And so you're seeing a range of countries around the world undertaking various types of reform. In some cases, they're clarifying the meaning of treaty provisions through authoritative interpretations. Some are revising their treaties through amendments to those treaties. Some are replacing the old treaties with new treaties through renegotiating those treaties. And in South Africa's case, our approach, and there are a number of other countries that have done the same, is to terminate treaties, particularly old generation treaties, either unilaterally or by mutual consent. My chapter then goes on to look at in some detail on what South Africa has done, and essentially South Africa's response was initiated with a 4-year review of investment treaties. So from about 2008 to 2010, we undertook an extensive review of all our investment treaties. We had international experts participating in that. It was multi-sectoral, different sectors in South African society participated. And that review was put forward in the form of a set of recommendations to our cabinet. And in 2010, the cabinet took a decision on the investment treaties. And there are probably 3 key elements of the decision which may be useful. The first one was that we terminate existing bilateral investment treaties that South Africa had entered into, and that we would only enter into new treaties or renegotiate old treaties if there were compelling economic reasons to do so, i.e. if we could be assured that there would be FDI flows as a result of signing on to the treaties. Second, if we were going to enter into new bilateral investment treaties or international treaties of any kind, we would need to do so on the basis of a new model treaty that would reduce the risks inherent in the earlier generation of bilateral investment treaties. The third element of the response was to develop a new investment act in South Africa, and at the beginning of this year, the new act came into force, which what it seeks to do is to provide clarity to foreign investors of the type of protection that they will receive in South Africa if they were to invest in South Africa. Now, the final part of the chapter, I think, is probably going towards answering the moderator's question on what should developing countries respond, how should they respond, and the role of South-South cooperation. And the chapter concludes by suggesting that African countries need to review their investment treaties overall. It makes the point that over the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a convergence and growing consensus amongst African leaders and business leaders and policy thinkers on the need for Africa to move off a growth path that has been based on consumption and imports, to move on to a more sustainable economic growth path based on industrialization and deeper integration in Africa. And against that set of priorities, which we've termed as structural transformation, the question arises as to whether the investment treaties that we've signed into facilitate or impede that process. And this is the review that we will, that the chapter proposes that we undertake with that question in mind. And essentially, it raises a couple of points, but it essentially argues that while there is some reform in current treaty practice, there does seem to be some recognition of the need to reform the treaties, to take into account government efforts to protect the environment or to protect public health. What we're seeing in some of the more recent treaties is that the support, that the measures that are needed to support industrialization are being closed off, and that, I think, relates to the chapter that Kinder had prepared. So when we look at the particular provisions in the latest treaties as they relate to technology transfer, research and development, employment and training, local purchasing of goods and services, downstream economic linkages, the joint ventures that we seek, all of those type of industrial development policies that governments are employing are being prohibited under the terms of some of the new treaties. So it argues that if this is the trajectory of the new treaty, of the reform process, this is not going to be something that serves Africa's interests, and we would need to look at a different approach to treaty making in this area. So essentially it's a call for African countries to review their treaties, assess them in light of the structural transformation objectives, and to participate in the international dialogue along these lines. So, thank you.
Thank you.